this war between Russia and the Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You wrote a piece about it in, what was it, The Federalist, I think, this week, titled The Truth About Ukraine's Failing Counteroffensive and the Peace That Could Have Been. Why don't you give us an overview of what you wrote and what your take is on the state of affairs right now?
Well, the thing that's been going on since around June 4th or June 5th is this long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. This has been touted for a long time as is going to reverse Russian territorial gains. Ukraine's going to use all of this modern Western equipment, these Leopard tanks that have come from Germany and Bradleys from the United States, and a lot of other NATO or American equipment, and they're going to push Russia out of their country. This has been told to us since the fall of last year, since that sort of Kharkiv counteroffensive produced some Ukrainian territorial gains. You've had former generals like Ben Hodges and Petraeus say that this counteroffensive is going to be highly successful. Where it stands right now is that around 18 or 19 days into it, it has produced minimal gains. In fact, it's been somewhat of a disaster. It's hard to get conclusive estimates of personnel and material losses, but I think as many as a quarter of the tanks and armored vehicles have already been destroyed. And the casualties may be as high as around 10,000 out of an army that was trained up for this purpose of around 50,000. So far it has not gone well. The Ukrainian army hasn't even made it to the first line of defense. So what the Russians did is they created 3 fortified lines or belts of defense. And then in front of that is what they call a gray zone or security zone or crumple zone, which is an area they can test, but it's not technically a fortified line. The Ukrainians are still in that sort of gray zone. They are not punching through. They are not even at the first Russian fortified line. To give you some idea of what's involved here, the Russians have these obstacles. There's basically trenches that have been dug. There's ditches that would stop tanks or sort of force them to go in a certain direction, steer the traffic. There's extensive minefields. They've got these things called dragon teeth, which are concrete bollards that stop tanks or move them in a certain direction. Then the Russians have massive amounts of artillery. They've got infantry on the ground that help spot the artillery. And if all of that doesn't take out these Ukrainian tanks, they've got these attack helicopters that come in almost uncontested, because at this point, it doesn't look like the Ukrainians have any air defense. And they've also got fixed-wing aircraft that are capable of dropping precision munitions. So it really seems like the Russians have fixed a lot of the problems that they had last fall in their army. And so far, it seems like this counteroffensive is not going anywhere.
We're 16 months into this, Chamath, and clearly fatigue is setting in. It's not commanding the news cycle here in America, and on a percentage basis, even the neocons and Republicans are dropping their support for this at a pretty precipitous rate, which is predictable. Americans don't want to be in forever wars. We all know that. So what's your take on how this winds up, especially in relation to A, our budget, and B, this upcoming election, which this seems to be, will be a major issue if this isn't resolved by the time we get into the 24 election cycle?
As part of answering this, I have a question for Sacks, but is it true that there was a ceasefire? Like Putin had a press conference where he showed a document that he said was a ceasefire, that then the United States apparently sent Boris Johnson over to Russia, Ukraine to basically blow up the agreement?
Is that true? Yes, this is fundamentally correct.
This wasn't a ceasefire. This was a peace deal before the war started, correct?
No, it was after.
Or this is what they claim?
There were rounds of negotiation before the war. Notably, there was a round of diplomacy between Blinken and Lavrov in January, the month before the war, where Blinken said that we cannot compromise on NATO's open door policy. That sort of diplomacy fell apart. But then after the war, there was a meeting of the Russian delegation and Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul under the supervision of Erdogan in Turkey. Naftali Bennett also had a similar process. In both cases, the West rejected a peace deal.
Allegedly. We don't. This is Putin we're talking about, right?
Let me
nobody
come back.
knows.
Well, hold on a second. Let me come back to the evidence for it in a second. But what the deal would have provided is that the Russians would move back to pre-war lines if the Ukrainians would agree not to become a member of NATO. However, the Ukrainians could still receive specified security guarantees from the West. That was the deal. Now,
allegedly.
Well, we have now multiple data points. You've got Naftali Bennett saying that he thought a deal was attainable on these lines, but it was rejected by the West. You also have now Putin showing the very document, which was signed by the Ukrainian delegation. So this was the document.
He flashed the document, right? Nobody has this document.
It hasn't been released yet.
Yes.
I hope the Russian government releases it for the purpose of history so we can inspect it. But nobody contests that this document is real. Remember, if he's just making this up, you would think that Erdogan would basically come forward and say, no, this is fake. There's too many people who are in that room who'd be able to say this document is fake. No one has done that. So I think there's every reason to believe this document is real. Now, it is not a final agreement. It appears to be a preliminary agreement or an outline. But the outline is that Russia is saying we will move back to pre-war lines if you agree not to become part of NATO. And that deal was rejected when Boris Johnson flew into Kyiv and basically told the Ukrainians, we do not want to make a deal with Putin. We want to pressure Putin. And the source for that is not the Russians. The source for that is a Ukrainian publication called Ukrainian Pravda, UP. And they ran an article in May of 2022 that I can put on the screen. And it is the source for saying that Boris Johnson came in and told Zelensky, we do not want to make a peace deal. We, the West, are not ready to make a deal with Putin. We want you to fight Putin or pressure Putin. And if you do, we will give you advanced weapon systems. And that is when the deal fell apart. If you look at the timing of it,
yes, allegedly.
This happened.
None of this has been this has been lightly sourced here. So let's just be clear.
But you have to consider the source here. This is a pro-Ukrainian publication writing in May of 2022. Now, the tone of the article and what they basically say in this article is that Zelensky accepted Boris Johnson's offer. In other words, he took the gamble. And at this point in time, you got to remember, this is 2 months after the war started. It looked like the Ukrainians were doing well. So UP was essentially praising Zelensky in this article for taking the West up on this deal to pressure Putin rather than make peace. Now, a year later, it looks like this gamble was a disaster.
Yeah.
And so that is the real conclusion here. A deal was available, but the West chose not to take it. By the way, Fiona Hill, who is a Russia hawk, and you could almost put her, I'd say, neocon adjacent, has basically said that this type of deal was available. The West did not want this deal.
I think, Jason, maybe to give you an answer, my thought is that this week was a very bad week for establishment politics and institutions. Because on the one hand, if you take the Russia incident and the Ukraine war, what you saw was that there were ample numbers of off-ramps that we chose, frankly, to not take so that we could engage our enemy in some long, drawn-out war on the hopes that it just depletes their resources. That's kind of rolling the dice, I think, in a very dangerous way. I think this week we also saw some published stuff on COVID and the COVID vaccine, which also debunked a lot of widely held truths. And it turned out that folks that may have been conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, were right there as well. So I think it's just an uncomfortable set of facts that, again, just reinforce that if you're not really thinking for yourself, you're not going to see the totality of what's actually going on. I think with respect to Russia, Ukraine, everybody has moved on. And so sadly, the only people that are left over are the people that have to fight the war, who are still separated from their families. There's the people that are dying. There was an article, I think today, they recruit prisoners, right? So obviously some of the prisoners that Russia uses are still pretty crazy. That person went on some rampage inside of a train, killed a couple people, stabbed some other people. There was just pictures of blood everywhere. I mean, this is just a horrible situation. And it's still not clear to me why we didn't take the off-ramp.
If, in fact, it's real. So I just want to keep putting that disclaimer out there because Putin flashing a document doesn't make all this true. It doesn't mean it's not true.
What about Ukrainian Pravda?
Well, Jason, I would say...
What about Naftali Bennett?
I am just being clear here that none of this is confirmed.
Data points do you need?
I would say...
What are you talking about? Naftali Bennett confirmed it. What incentive does the former Israeli leader have to lie about this?
Here's what I would say, Jason. I think that something like that is so profoundly important that if it were not true, I think it would have been very important for the powers that be to discredit it almost immediately so that they didn't have to look like they were warmongering unnecessarily.
Can I also up-level and connect to this point about the establishment? Because I think there's been a lot of pushback to even challenging the status quo, even having a conversation about Ukraine or having a conversation about COVID. And I think if there's one thing this pod represents, the fight going on at Twitter represents, is the need to have this conversation. If we look at the wars the U.S. has engaged in since September 11th, it's estimated 3 to 4 million people have died in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We spent $8 trillion. Inflation adjusted, we spent $4 trillion in World War II. $8 trillion represents 25% of our entire national debt. And I've yet to meet a single parent who said to me, I care so much about this Ukraine situation, I would be willing to put my children in harm's way to fight for the defense of Europe. Okay, so those data points tell me at a very minimum, we need more of this discussion, more of this debate, not less.
The idea that we could be tiptoeing closer and closer to some land war in Europe unnecessarily, and I think the bigger issue is, and you can't trust what you're being told. And I think that's what's very problematic.
That is a bigger picture. And just so we're clear here, I'm not saying I'm on either side of this. I'm just pointing out that this is all still very thinly sourced.
No, it's not.
Until the West confirms any of this,
What do you expect the West to do? You expect the State Department to issue a press release saying, yep, we fucked up. It's on me.
My theory,
Yeah,
what do you think
liars.
they're going to do? My theory from the beginning
lying.
has been, and I've been very clear on this podcast, my theory has been since the beginning, they want to deplete Russia and they want to deplete their army and their capabilities and have regime change in Putin. Now, I'm not saying I'm for that, just for the people who are not listening.
I'm not debating that.
You said it would ankle Putin. That was the crude language you used.
That is what they plan on doing. Yes, I think that's what they're doing. And
Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, said that our purpose was to weaken Russia.
Yes.
So to knock it out of the ranks of the great powers.
What their purpose is. Yes, but I think they want regime change. Yes,
that's what Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and said. We want to pressure Putin, not make a deal with him. So they courted this war. They preferred.
And that's been my theory since the beginning.
They preferred to fight a proxy war of choice that was easily avoidable.
I'm not endorsing that.
Take NATO expansion off the table.
This is not about you, Jason. I'm asking a simple question,
Sacks
which is
why.
Said
it was. But Sacks just said it was, Chamath. So I'm just clearing it for the record. He just did. He said that was your position, and I'm correcting him.
Okay, fair enough, Jason.
I have the right to correct you. That was not my position. I said that's my theory.
Fine. I actually agree with you if you're saying that was our government's objective, which was to weaken Putin. I agree with you. They chose to fight an optional proxy war of choice that was easily avoidable if they'd just taken NATO expansion off the table because they thought it would weaken Putin. But here's the rub on this. It has not weakened Putin. It has weakened the United States and our allies. Any way you want to look at this thing, look at just the weapons and munitions. So we are out of 155 millimeter artillery shells. We cannot produce enough. This is the crazy thing. We spend $800 billion a year plus on the Pentagon and our national defense. We're out of ammo. I mean, we must be getting so royally ripped off by the military-industrial complex. Okay, we cannot produce ammo fast enough. That's why Ukraine's losing this war. The balance of artillery favors Russia. Russia is basically using about 20,000 shells a day. The Ukrainians are using somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000. We are out of ammo. We cannot produce enough.
And this actually dovetails nicely with another story this week. There is a journalist named Matt Yglesias. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Matt Yglesias, yeah.
Yglesias. And he said, he literally said the quiet part out loud. And I'll just quote, because he was criticizing you and Chamath for hosting RFK. We'll get to that in a second. But he basically said, this is actually a really good idea for us. Basically, NATO equipment plus Ukrainian lives are being traded for Russian equipment and Russian lives, which leaves NATO coming out ahead. That's doubly true because NATO is much richer than Russia. So we win a long-term game of everyone explode their weapons as fast as they can, make them. Again, though, what makes that really true is NATO material is killing Russian soldiers while Russian material is killing Ukrainian soldiers. That's a deal in our favor. I mean, That is a cynical
To be clear,
of
he
a
wrote
summary
that,
of that.
Yeah, he wrote that last year in defense of the war. Basically, like all the neocons, he's sort of an establishment-approved intellectual. They think he's smart. I think he's really foolish. He basically wants to fight the last Ukrainian here for the sole purpose of blowing up Russia's stockpiles. The reason this is so dumb is Russia can always make more. Those lives aren't coming back, but they can always produce more artillery, more weapons. And in fact, the Russian war machine is now ramping up to full production, okay? They are ramping up the number of people in their army. I think it's estimated that by the end of the year, they're going to have 750,000 men under arms. They've ramped up artillery shells production. They were at something like 1.5 million at the beginning of the war. We were only producing 14,000 artillery shells a month, mostly for training purposes in the United States. We've since ramped that up to 20,000, but that still massively trails what the Russians can do. And they're trying to ramp it up to 90,000 a month, but that's going to take till 2028 because it takes time to build. You got to build up new factories, new production lines. You got to issue contracts to suppliers or vendors. It takes time to do this. But the Russians basically have ramped up their war machine. And then the other thing that's happened is that Russia and China have entered a de facto alliance, and including Iran. So you now have the cementing of this giant alliance in Asia between China, Russia, and Iran. They're sharing equipment now together. Iran is producing drones for Russia. Russia is now going to be giving advanced fighter jets to Iran. So this idea that this war has made the West stronger, it's depleting the West over an objective we didn't need to fight. This war was easily avoidable. And we have now created, I think, the most fearsome opponent that America has ever faced. We have never faced an adversary with a combined manufacturing capacity and raw materials of China, Russia, and Iran. If we were to get in a war, a new world war against this sort of new axis, we could lose. They actually have more manufacturing capacity to produce weapons of war and munitions and ammo than the United States does.
China has been clear that they're not going to provide weapons to Russia. And so I'm not sure that alliance is exactly accurate.
They've given us no such assurance. All they've said is they haven't done it yet.
It's a theoretical thing that you're talking about here that could be very serious. I think your point, and this is to Brad's point, we should be having a very thoughtful discussion here, because if China did pick Russia, which they haven't, and they went to war, it would be World War III. They said explicitly to us that they're not going to. Let's go to COVID.
Well, we should talk about the China relationship, actually.
Yeah, okay.